Over 1,200 kilometers away from Ukraine, Russia was protecting something irreplaceable. Another of its major arteries, which has been pumping cash into Putin's war machine, was hidden away. Russia thought the artery was safe. Ukraine just sliced it wide open in a single surgical strike that changes everything. Ukraine just wiped out a key oil facility. Putin can only watch the artery bleed as Ukraine introduces him to the new reality of the war that he started. We head to the Republic of Tatarstan. Nestled in the confluence between the Kama and Volga rivers, Tatarstan was never supposed to be on Ukraine's radar. It's inside the Russian Federation for one, and it's so deep inside that Ukraine's drones would have to travel well over 1,000 kilometers or more than 600 miles just to reach it. The Republic was supposed to be safe, secure, the perfect place for Putin to position some of Russia's most important oil facilities, because there was no way that Ukraine would ever be able to make that oil burn. You can probably guess where we're going with this one. Putin was dead wrong. And Ukraine just proved it with a devastating February 23rd strike that has rocked Russia and, as you'll discover later, has caused massive problems with the pipeline that Russia relies upon to keep the dirty money that it gets from its oil. When dawn broke in the Almatyevsk district of Tatarstan, the district's citizens experienced a morning like no other. There would be no peaceful wake-up. Instead, the sounds of sirens filled the air, along with the desperate honking of factory horns, as a series of powerful explosions rocked the district. These explosions, as terrifying as they would have been, weren't the result of weapons that targeted Almatyevsk's civilians. Ukraine had indeed sent some of its most powerful long-range weapons into the district, but every single one was focused on a single military target, the Kalyakino main oil pumping station, which belongs to JSC Transneft Prikamya. Ukraine's drones had traveled more than 1,200 kilometers, or about 745 miles, to reach this target, and they struck one by one against a pumping station that feeds into the massive Druzhba pipeline that Russia has been using to generate income since the beginning of Putin's invasion. What Ukraine hit was no ordinary oil facility. As News Sky explains in its report on the Ukrainian strike, Kalyakino is a major Russian oil artery. It's a strategic mixer of the Russian energy sector. It's here that oil flows from western Siberia and the Ural-Volga region accumulate. Here, the raw materials are mixed to the required export conditions and sent further under high pressure to the Druzhba main oil pipeline and towards sea terminals, the outlet says of what Ukraine hit on February 23rd. And it followed it up with what might stand as the main reason that Ukraine chose this particular pumping station ahead of all others. Almost a third of all Russia's oil exports pass through this specific station. We'll get into the financial damage that Ukraine has just done to Russia in a few minutes. Before that, let's focus on the more tangible damage that we see in the wake of Ukraine's latest deep strike. According to UKR Inform, the drones that Ukraine dispatched to Tatarstan were operated by the Security Service of Ukraine, or SBU, and they scored multiple hits over the course of the strike. An SBU source tells UKR Inform that 6 explosions were heard at the targeted pumping stations, and at least one of Ukraine's drones scored a direct hit on oil storage tanks located at the facility. A massive fire was the result, and both photographs and videos of that fire have already made their way to Telegram. As it so often is, the Russian outlet Astra was among the first to showcase the true scale of the damage that Ukraine just did to Russia's hidden oil artery. It shares several videos that are clearly shot from a massive distance away from the scene of Ukraine's attack. Huge flames are seen creeping into the night sky, and using geolocated images, Astra has been able to confirm that it was indeed the Kalyakino pumping station that bore the brunt of Ukraine's drone assault. The first frame was taken from a distance of 3.5 to 4 kilometers from the OPS, while the second video was taken from 5 kilometers away, Astra says of the videos that it shares, which just goes to show the sheer scale of the fire that Ukraine caused. For a blaze to be visible from that distance, it has to be so overwhelmingly enormous that it could take days to put out. And even with the fire quelled, Russia then has to deal with the difficult job of carrying out repairs, which could take its oil pumping station out of commission for weeks, not months. Faced with a fire so massive that it can be seen from far and wide, Russia did what it always does in the wake of a successful Ukrainian deep strike, lied through its teeth. Militani shares the comments made by Russian officials in the wake of the attack, who said, "Air defense systems on duty neutralized a UAV in the sky over the Almatyevsky district. As a result of falling debris in the industrial zone, a localized fire started." Really, Russia? Are we going with the drone debris excuse again? A fire that could be seen from 5 kilometers or about 3 miles away was caused by scraps of metal and plastic debris that just so happened to once again hit the specific thing that Ukraine wanted to hit. If this is Russia's air defenses in action, it's starting to feel like Putin would have better luck if he ordered his air defenses to fire on the facilities that Ukraine is targeting. At least then, Russia wouldn't have to pretend that those defenses have been in any way useful when it comes to stopping Ukraine's drones. So the world's most accurate drone debris has struck again, and what this means for Russia, as Military explains, is that it's lost a pumping station that receives and blends oil from several different territories, which is then fed into the Druzhba pipeline. When operating as it should, the Kalyukino pumping station serves some of Russia's main refineries, in addition to sending oil directly to some of the countries that continue to buy from Russia, even as Putin and his country are weighed down by sanctions. You could even call what Ukraine just did a middle finger directed straight at one of the countries that Russia supplies with its illicit oil, but we'll come back to that particular country in a moment. Military says the pumping station that Ukraine just hit can receive and pump up to 350,000 tons of oil per day. The outlet claims that this is equivalent to 4.2 million tons per year, but the maths doesn't add up there. Are the Military meant to say that the Kalyukino station receives 350,000 tons of oil per month, which then adds up to the 4.2 million a year figure, or it did the wrong sums? 350,000 tons of oil daily adds up to 127.75 million tons per year, which is more in keeping with the more than 100 million tons of oil that senior fellow at the Caspian Policy Center, Dr. Eric Rudenscholz, shared in a post about Ukraine's strike on LinkedIn. The 100 million plus figure seems the most likely to be correct, and it leads us nicely into the reasons why Ukraine has carried out this particular strike. Solving the Druzhba pipeline problem is chief among those reasons. We mentioned earlier that the Kalyukino station processes about 30% of the crude oil that Russia sends to major export routes, such as the Druzhba pipeline. That oil comes from several different sources, including Tatarstan itself, along with Western Siberia, Bashkortostan, and Udmurtia. In other words, what Ukraine just took out is a key node within a massive network that exists solely to keep money flowing into Russia. Before Putin launched his invasion, that money helped the Russian people. Now it's being spent on the catastrophic invasion that Russia's leader started 4 years ago. The Druzhba pipeline as a whole has a capacity of 2 million barrels of Russian oil per day, though it's unclear if the pipeline always hits that capacity. If we assume that maximum capacity is reached, this means that the Druzhba pipeline is moving millions of dollars of oil for Russia every month. Even with the $44.10 price cap that has been placed on Russian crude oil by the European Union or EU, 2 million barrels per day adds up to $88.2 million. Multiply that by 365 days in a year and you get almost $32.2 billion, even with the heavy discounts that Russia is being forced to place on its crude oil due to EU sanctions. Of course, not all of the oil that flows through the Druzhba pipeline is sold to other countries. As we mentioned earlier, some of it's sent to refineries inside Russia. Still, Ukraine taking out a pumping station that's responsible for processing about 30% of the crude oil that flows through the Druzhba pipeline is a massive win for Ukraine. It means that Russia is losing millions, if not tens of millions of dollars, for each day that the pumping station Ukraine hit remains unrepaired. And given the sheer size of the fire caused, which is so large that Russia doesn't even likely know the extent of the damage that it needs to repair, it seems likely that the Kalyukino station is going to be offline for a good while yet. As New Sky puts it, what Ukraine just did has created a domino effect across the entire Transneft logistic network. Oil won't be getting to where Russia needs it to go because a key pumping station has been destroyed. That means that crude oil that was meant to be en route has to be stored, which causes a backlog on the back end. You can't send more crude into storage facilities that are already full of oil that were meant to have been transported away. On the other end of the pipeline, Russian refineries that are supposed to be making fuel and other oil-based products have to deal with delays, as do the countries that continue to import Russian oil via the Druzhba pipeline. And speaking about exports, we mentioned something about this particular strike being a middle finger that Ukraine has thrown up to one country in particular earlier in the video. We're about to tell you which country that is, but before we do, you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to hit that button. Now, there is one country that is going to be very angry about the Druzhba domino effect that Ukraine has just created: Hungary. Or more accurately, Hungary's Putin apologist Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, is going to be raging about Ukraine taking a big slice out of the Druzhba pipeline pie. And the reason is that Orbán was already angry that Ukraine hadn't carried out repairs on the portion of that massive pipeline network that runs through its territory and into Hungary. Orbán is so infuriated by this supposed slight that he is attempting to force the EU to pump the brakes on the €90 billion or $106 billion loan that is set to provide to Ukraine using the Russian assets that are frozen in the EU. Hungary did not oppose the decision, based on the understanding that the loan will not have an impact on the financial obligations, Orbán said of his attempts to veto the loan, as reported by Politico on February 23rd. He added that Recent developments have forced me to reconsider my position. Those developments are apparently Ukraine slow-walking on repairs to the Druzhba pipeline on its own territory. Orban is trying to claim that Ukraine is aggressively trying to prevent Hungary from buying Russian oil. Here's the twist. It was Russia that caused the damage to the Druzhba pipeline in Ukraine in the first place. One of Russia's drone attacks struck the portion of the pipeline that serves Hungary, along with Slovakia, which begs the question, why should Ukraine fix what Russia broke? If Orban is so concerned about not getting Russian oil anymore, maybe he should be demanding that Putin ceases his attacks on Ukraine. Adding to this is that both Hungary and Slovakia have around 90 days of oil supplies, so it's not like Ukraine needs to hurry to repair a pipeline that Russia broke in the first place. Still, Hungary is trying to veto the EU loan until it gets its way, so Ukraine's latest attack is something of a middle finger to Orban. If Hungary's prime minister is going to whine about the damage that Russia did, then Ukraine can just make it worse by taking out the oil that flows through the Druzhba pipeline as its source. By the way, the Council of the European Union has approved the two pieces of legislation that make the loan that the EU wants to provide for Ukraine legal on February 24th, so Orban's threats about a veto may not be as serious as they first appear. Moving on, Ukraine also struck the Kalykino pumping station because it knew that doing so would deliver a massive blow to Russia's federal budget. Stick with us because before we get to that, there's another impact of this strike that may go underappreciated, the psychological aspect. Think about the mechanics of what Ukraine pulled off with the Kalykino strike. It had to send drones, which News Sky says were likely advanced E-300 Enterprise long-range drones over 740 miles into Russia. Those drones moved at low altitudes along forested areas and riverbeds, the outlet says, and they hit their targets so accurately that their error numbers can't be more than a handful of feet. And the drones did all of that after flights that would have taken about 10 hours, which was all time that the drones spent flying autonomously without being destroyed by Russia's air defenses. The sheer psychological scarring that an attack like this causes is immense. Places like Tatarstan aren't meant to be targets. Technically, Putin thought that nowhere in Russia would be in danger when he launched his invasion, but a far-flung region like Tatarstan should be well out of Ukraine's reach, but it isn't. The sirens that blared as Kalykino burned served as a harsh reminder to Tatarstan's people that Putin has led his country in a war that is not only coming home but penetrating deeper into Russia. Schools being shut down and airports being suspended whenever Ukraine's drones arrive are further reminders. The Russian people's faith in Putin as a protector is broken by strikes like these, and Ukraine's former intelligence chief and now the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, explained that this would be the case way back in September 2024. Ukraine's strikes into Russia, which were just getting off the ground at that point, had achieved an important goal. The Russian people's belief in that they live in a safe country has been broken, Budanov explains, adding that it's the main achievement of all these deep strikes. While psychological pressure probably isn't the main achievement of Ukraine's deep strikes in 2026, it's powerful enough that even Putin is feeling the fear. Back in March 2025, when Putin was pushing for a partial ceasefire rather than the total one being offered at the time, he made a point to ask that this ceasefire cover long-range strikes. In other words, Putin is scared of Ukraine's long-range drones and the damage they can do to Russia's people. And ultimately, it's Putin who is watching as the country he leads bleeds out financially as a result of attacks like the one we've just seen in Tatarstan. With that, we come back to the financial aspect. News Sky points out that what Ukraine just did is a blow to Russia's federal budget, the majority of which comes from taxation on the revenues that Russia's oil and gas companies generate by selling via pipelines such as Druzhba. A major pumping station going down means that less money is made, as we established earlier. However, we didn't touch on how the timing of Ukraine's latest strike was absolutely perfect. As the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies notes, oil and gas account for anywhere between 30 and 50% of Russia's entire federal budget revenue in any given year. While not quite a case of Russia having all of its eggs in one basket, these percentages are more than high enough to make it so that any disruption caused to Russia's energy sector causes major problems. And now, with so much of Russia's federal budget being dedicated to funding the Ukraine war, the cost of the Russian people, Ukraine is focusing on ways to make Russia's budget situation as bad as possible. Why? Russia already faces a budget crisis. Now it's going to get worse. As the Moscow Times reported on February 6th, Russia posted a federal budget deficit of $22.3 billion in January, with the $30.7 billion in revenue that the country generated being 11.6% lower than it was a year earlier. Oil and gas revenue in particular had fallen by 50% to a 5-year low, marking January 2026 as a month when Russia made less from its most valuable sector than it had at any other point during the war. This is all notable because Russia has a budget deficit of $49.4 billion for 2026. We're not even out of February yet, and the current deficit is veering close to half of that amount. If things continue going the way they are for Russia, that target will be in the rearview mirror by the time we're halfway through 2026. More economic pain is being heaped onto Russia, and Ukraine is piling it all on with its death by 1,000 cuts strategy that sees it constantly targeting Russian oil. With attacks on pumping stations now being added to the refinery strikes we saw intensify throughout 2025, Ukraine is sending the message to Putin that it can hit Russian oil no matter where it is or where Russia tries to hide it. The beginning of the end for Putin's war has arrived. With the Tatarstan strike, Ukraine has just ramped up a deep strike campaign that is going to force Russia into bleeding out long before Putin's troops in Ukraine can take the territory that he needs them to take. And speaking of Ukraine pulling off historic strikes inside Russia, it was only a couple of weeks ago that we were talking about what must go down as one of the most impressive deep strikes that Ukraine has ever carried out. Nowhere in Russia is safe, including one location that is key to Russia's missile war. If you want to find out more about Ukraine kicking off February with a long-range bang, make sure you check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show, so you always find out about the most important deep strikes that Ukraine carries out. And thank you as always for watching.